our time as we go through this. Today's webinar is on innovation, if you've heard about, and we are very honored to have Dr. Bernard Bull with us. He was most recently, the Chief Innovation Officer and Vice Provost of Curriculum and Innovation at Concordia University, Wisconsin. And if I can brag a little bit on you, the scale of what Concordia University, Wisconsin did and does today in online, non-traditional, low residency programs is amazing. It was a leader within the Concordia system in innovation in doing this. And Bernard, I mean, this has been going on for at least 2 decades, right? Somewhere in that.
Yeah,
range.
the president, John Book, the one before this, he really helped lead basically a distance learning before online learning initiative. It was maybe even a little too radical. The creditors didn't quite support everything that was done, and they had to pare back quite a bit. And then when I arrived, it was just, in some ways, there was already some really good work happening. Some of the health science programs had begun some online learning, collaborative-based online learning in the prior years. And they were there were still programs that were mailing packets of work back and forth and using photocopies of photocopies of photocopies back and forth and the like. And so I kind of came in at that transition phase and got to be a part of a really great team that helped sort of expand and build on that prior work a bit.
Well, it was an amazing process and led the Concordias in innovation in terms of educational programs and financial models, different ways to think about how we fund our institutions. Today, Dr. Bull is the president of Goddard College. He is also a widespread and active voice in higher education. And I sent you out links to his website and some of his publications. But I like one in particular. I mean, Missional Moonshots, Bernard, is a great book. But I really like these questions about what really matters, 10 critical issues in contemporary education. And so he's going to talk to you all today about those ideas and innovation, and now he's sort of living it out at an institution in a leadership role. So Bernard, you have the floor.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to spend a little time with you. We'll keep it nice and informal. In the past years, I've really had a pretty formal presentation on sort of some recommendations and some insights about just being a leader of innovation. And we can certainly do that. And I have a slide deck that I can use as a guide for us. But what I thought I might also do is use a little of the time and just share a bit about what I'm doing right now, do a little storytelling. And maybe we can have some conversation about that. So this is going a little different angle. So I hope that you get what you want and need out of it. So I grew up in the Lutheran education system, at least from 6th grade on. My father died when I was 12, and my mom remarried a man who had kind of lived in send his kids to Lutheran schools. And so I ended up switching over from public schools to Lutheran schools around 6th grade. And it was a really, really important time in my life, obviously, having sort of lost a father figure, having a stepfather, but still sort of, building a relationship with this new man in my life. And so school was really like a home to me, a second home. And the sense of community was really critical to my own formation. And so I went to a Lutheran high school and then had a few options. I played basketball, so I had a few options to play basketball different places. But this coach from Concordia University, Wisconsin, Wayne Rasmussen, drove down to Illinois where I was going to school and watched a game and asked me a question. He said, "So tell me about your range, your shooting range." And I said, "Well, I can maybe 8 feet." And he thought, "Wow, I've never ever recruited someone so humble," until he realized I was exaggerating. And so I ended up going to Concordia, Wisconsin, largely because I found this amazing role model, a mentor who became my basketball coach. And I got to Concordia, Wisconsin, and met some other really incredible role models as well. In fact, Bill Cario, who's the provost there, was my advisor. Another education professor, Jim Ferguson, the current president, Patrick Berry, came in my first year as a student there, and he was a formative influence in my life. And so, for me, Lutheran education was really a place where it was a place for coming of age. It was a place for sort of personal discovery and formation. It was a place of healing and dealing with a sense of loss. And it was a place where I really kind of came into my own and developed a sense of identity, my identity in Christ, and also just my role in the world. And, where do I fit? My odd, unusual psyche and all that is, what does that look like? So I graduated and ended up going into Lutheran education on the K-12 level and quickly being addicted to school and learning. I read voraciously and started collecting degrees. And then I started my own consulting business in my mid-20s. I was 24 years old and I started a consulting business helping nonprofits prepare for the future because I loved taking on new challenges. And I worked with a small Bible college, I worked with churches, I worked with other nonprofit agencies and entities, and even started taking on some other for-profits. And really, that's where I started honing my skills of just trend analysis, identifying patterns and trends, and then help people come up with strategies for how you move forward and how you adapt. And how do you know when something's just a shiny object versus that's going to fade, just a passing fad? And how do you know when something's likely to stick? And even when you know it, how do you know the rate at which it's going to change? And I still am not an expert in that one. That last part is the hardest of them all, especially in a highly regulated industry like education. And that's kind of, so I started doing that. And eventually, make a long story short, I took, after I was near finishing my doctorate, I was working on a grant-funded initiative. One of the projects that group had was to go to Concordia, was by Concordia University, Wisconsin, to do a SWOT analysis of the distributed learning at Concordia, Wisconsin. And I did that. And in fact, I think, Leah, you were one of the people I interviewed. I interviewed about 50 people, faculty members and others. And that was before you were in your current role. And I think you lived in Milwaukee for a while and then came back. But that's at the point where I gave some recommendations, and they said, "Oh, great, we'd like to hire you to come and try to implement some of this." And so I did, and I started an instructional design center, kind of a center for excellence learning and teaching, but really more on the product side than on the teaching and learning side, and trying to help refine and grow online learning. And then went through a few different title changes and responsibility adjustments and changes over the years at Concordia. Spent a dozen years there. During that time, that's where my research really took off, and I started being more recognized for my writing and thinking around innovation, change management, and got to do a lot of consulting and took on some clients like Harvard Business Publishing to help them sort of reimagine their product line. I got to work with the Economic Task Force at Markle with Mendel and Albright chairs to help them prepare for workforce development and education intersections. I got to help with about a dozen different higher ed institutions prepare for launching their online programs. I got to help a number of K-12 schools start and launch, and it was really a lot of fun. And so every time I would do this extra work, it would give me a new idea, and I'd be able to bring that back to Concordia. And sometimes it would be a seed for a new possibility or idea. I'd say that out of every 10 ideas that I try, 2 of them would be successful. And so I just kind of persist through that. I think a 20% success rate for investors, that's actually pretty good. But in the education world, that's not as tolerated. I mean, we're not used to that way of thinking. So I know I'm doing a lot of background here, but so I never saw myself leaving the Concordia system, and I kind of envisioned myself coming back someday, or the Lutheran education system more broadly someday. But I was really troubled by sort of the change in what was happening in our nation over the last few years around civil discourse, or the lack thereof. And being at Concordia, I was really interested in themes around diversity, equity, inclusion more at the end, but I didn't really know how to get into that and how to do that in that context. And at the same time, I was also really intrigued by what it means in a current landscape to really live, love, and learn across difference, where I come from a pretty conservative Lutheran Christian background, and what does it mean for me to really respect and honor and see people who hold wildly different viewpoints from me? and to really love and learn from them in a way that I'm not compromising my own convictions and they're not compromising theirs, but we are learning, and maybe God does something really magical in that space, in that place. And I guess I wasn't sure if I was going to be in a position to necessarily do that at Concordia, Wisconsin, although I think there's great work probably being done there now in that area and will in the future. But when I found out about this presidency at Goddard College, Goddard was launched in the 1930s in response to the growth of fascism in the West, with the belief that an education system predicated purely upon tradition and compliance and conformity to the will of the authority figures wasn't necessarily the most effective way to nurture active and engaged citizens who believe that their voices and their choices matter, and that their vote actually matters, and that they can effect change in society and in the world. And so it was a college built with no letter grades. The students actually designed their own curriculum and learning plans every semester. There are no courses in the traditional sense. And in its current iteration, students only come for 10 days each semester. And so it's a really radically different model. As someone who had been studying experimental, innovative practices in education, I knew Goddard from decades ago because I'd read books about it. And so when I saw this position pop up, I thought, wow, this is incredible. I think I have to give this a try. I even talked, Leah and I talked to lots of people. I got feedback from all sorts of people. And it was one of the hardest decisions in my life to kind of step out of a system that I love and that is still home to me. But it was also an incredible, what felt like almost a once in a lifetime chance. And Tom, I got consulting from many people. So and plenty who said, don't take it. And some said, I don't know, it's up to you. But part of why I did it was because this college is so distinct. It has a completely distinct model. It really resonates with what a niche population in the nation and the world are craving and seeking. But it was a college that was put on probation. It was at risk of closure. I probably wouldn't have taken it if it were stable. But I took it because I thought this is an incredible opportunity for me to take some of my lessons learned in the past, to see if I can lean into this diversity, equity, and inclusion theme, to really support a model philosophy that really resonates with me personally in terms of my own educational philosophy, and to see whether these innovation practices can help turn around a college. I will say that in this current landscape with the college, it is more like a game of poker than it is of chess, because you can play every move right and still lose the game. You have to play your hand as best as you can. And that's true for many of us in many of our leadership capacities, is that we don't control all of the factors. And that's part of what's uncomfortable and messy about innovation for many people as well, is because innovation you don't have a guaranteed result. Experimentation by nature, if it's a true experiment, you don't know the outcome. And so you can try to control and manage risk, but it's embracing a kind of ambiguity. And I developed a good comfort. The more you embrace innovations, the more you get comfortable with experiencing failures and learning from them and treating them as kind of gifts and opportunities to learn and adjust and adapt quickly. The more you develop a bit of a sort of a comfort level to live within that uncomfortable space. That uncomfortable space is the place where I would argue that some of the most incredible innovation and opportunity arises in our institutions. And many of us are so uncomfortable with the messiness or with just the emotion that it conjures in us, that we do whatever we can to clean the mess up or to step out of it so that we can feel better individually and personally. And I would say that one of the callings of the innovator is to stand in that gap, is to step in that place that is sometimes the most uncomfortable. That if you look at your institution right now and you say, where are the meetings and the places that I am most uncomfortable, but seem to be one of the most critical conversations for us going forward right now, I would argue that the calling of the innovator is to find and to step into that place. Or if you don't believe that you have cultivated the skill set or the mindset to be that innovator, that change manager in that place or that time, I would say find the people who are and protect them. Protect them as much as possible. Insulate them from being sucked back into the status quo and give them the space. These are the people that annoy the heck out of you. These are the people that are coming with far more ideas than they can possibly implement, or they are just act without permission, or they're always looking for ways around the policies and practices because for them policies are recommendations, or they're or they are challenging. They sometimes come off as incredibly contrarian. I mean, they have these different mindsets, but it's part of the gift of a diverse community, is that these are people who can bring incredible gifts. Now, need to be managed. I need to be managed, which is a tricky part being the president. I have a board, so they get to hold me in check. But that's a really, really powerful space. So I share that kind of that own story to introduce this theme of innovation, because what I've done is essentially stepped into one of the most uncomfortable places of my life. I mean, this is a place where I have absolutely no guarantee that I will have a job in a month, or I have no guarantee that even if we can't make it, that I can provide an elegant closure to a college that's been around since the 1930s. I can do my absolute best, but there are risks and there are factors even beyond my control, or some within my control, but you have to make the decision so quickly that oftentimes you make the decision and only minutes later you realize you made the wrong one, or at least one that was less helpful. And I think that's kind of the nature of leadership in our rapidly changing pace. I'm right now, I'm at an event at Southern New Hampshire University where it's kind of like a secret society of higher ed innovators. We have representations from Stanford, University of Michigan, Harvard. We have Davidson College. We have Southern New Hampshire University, Arizona State, a bunch of other places. And we all gather. It's a group of less than 50 of us. And we keep, it's kind of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And we sort of share what's happening in our places and where we're going next. And it's really incredible what people are doing in higher ed. I mean, I'm sitting on the campus of Southern New Hampshire University. It was a few thousand students, 2 decades ago. And the president is the former president of Marlborough College, a college of less than 500 students. He came in from there to Southern New Hampshire University and grew it right now to where I think it's 70,000. They're prepping themselves to scale to 90,000 and trying to build an infrastructure so that they're capable of serving 300,000 students. And that's one university. I guarantee you that will challenge some of us, especially those of you that have adult programs and others, but they're reaching deeply into the undergraduate and residential population in creative ways as well. But I was just talking to one person and he shared some videos. He shared a video clip of a crew for a racer, like a Indy 500 kind of race. And he showed the winning race car from 30 years ago stopping in the pit crew. And he stops, and there's like a guy washing the windshield and cleaning it. And it was incredible. It took them like 50 seconds to change the wheels and get back on the road. And it's pretty amazing, right? Except if you fast forward to today, that same thing is less than 5 seconds. So just the innovation in the pit crew at the Indy 500 went from 50 seconds to 5 seconds in a couple of decades or even less. And we're kind of in that space right now. And the part that's so hard about innovation is imagining these possibilities. And most people in communities, when you begin to innovate and try to pursue something new, they perceive it as a loss or as a harm to the organization or the entity. I'll give the example. They actually did this. They took a bunch of data scientists and they gave them all of the data points associated with a seed. And then they gave them all the data points associated with a seed that had sprouted, just recently sprouted, within a day. And they showed it to them and they asked them without telling them that it was a seed or that it was a seed that sprouted, simply by looking at it mathematically and looking at the data points. They said, so tell me what happened here. And they said, if they said, this is the same thing, these are the two things, what happened? And every single one of the data scientists interpreted as the first thing has been destroyed. The seed, what ended up being the seed, they defined it as a destruction. Same thing happens with a caterpillar to a butterfly whenever you kind of assess the data points and the like. If you take a group of engineers and you give them any team in the world and you give them a caterpillar and you say, okay, improve this, make it something amazing or better, not one of those teams will give you a butterfly. They will give you a better caterpillar. They'll give you something maybe that has shiny eyes or something like that, or maybe it has a new tech or something in it. And the space of innovation, especially when we talk about disruptive innovation or kind of creating new spaces or serving populations that are underserved or unmet right now, that's really that's really kind of the power. So anyway, let me just dive in then to some more practical kind of applied pieces. So if any of this resonates with you, you're thinking, yeah, I want to posture myself or position myself to be able to tolerate standing in that gap a little bit more and helping to identify those sort of sprouting seed moments and helping to navigate that change where people feel like it's been destroyed, but in fact, it's actually just grown into what it could be. And so if you're interested in that, there's some great research on what it takes for a leader to become that. And I've actually done some of my own primary research on that. And I have a list of 10 traits of innovative leaders, but I'm not going to share that with you today. Instead, I'm going to take you to one that's kind of a tried and tested one. And some of you may even be familiar with the book, but we can use it as a source of discussion. And this is a work from one of my favorite scholars, Clayton Christensen. Let me see here, make sure. Can you see the screen now? You see my, oops, I need to get the slideshow going. There we go. You probably see full screen now. Does that look good? Okay, I see a couple of nods. By the way, this is one of those quotes that people attribute to Abraham Lincoln or Einstein because they don't know where it really came from. The best way to predict the future is to create it. But I do really believe that as a futurist myself. There are three categories of futurists. One are people who use kind of hardcore game theory and sometimes economic models and the like to identify where things are going. There's another that's more interdisciplinary and they use both humanities and data and others to identify trends and patterns, look at investment patterns, look at regulatory patterns, look at just ideas and trends. And then there's a third category that taps into both of those, but they also are not neutral. They're essentially saying, I want to help create the future. I want to be a co-creator of where things go. So they don't just stop at kind of that descriptive level. And that's kind of where I identify myself. And I would argue that anyone who embraces the role as a higher ed leader is kind of stepping into that third role as well. The book I was talking about is Innovator's DNA, and this is a great book. If you haven't read it already, I highly recommend it. It's been around for a while, and so Jeff Dyer is the primary author, but Clayton Christensen is a Harvard Business School professor. He's the one that coined the term disruptive innovation. You may be familiar with, and this is a great text that sort of highlights the skill sets, the sort of tangible skill sets of an innovator and the kinds of things that you can actually personally, that you can develop habits and practices to cultivate these in yourself, and they can prepare you and help you develop that disposition to take advantage of those innovations and even to begin to notice opportunities and possibilities. By the way, I will preface this by saying many people, when they think of innovators and innovation, they think of brainstormers. They think of idea people who just come up with lots of ideas. That is a part and an important part of innovation, but it's actually a relatively small part of the most effective innovators. There are lots of people who come up with great ideas. In fact, when I first arrived at Goddard, this is a place rampant with ideas. I had hundreds of ideas on my table before the first day ended, it seemed. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but before the first week. The problem was we didn't execute on them very well, or we didn't winnow them down and identify and understand them enough. So the skills of the innovator will introduce you to some skill sets about brainstorming, but I would argue that two of the most underutilized but critical skill sets of an innovator, well, I'll say three. One is becoming really good at defining problems. So learning to identify a problem, but then define it in a way that doesn't just make it clean and easy for you. Some people are drawn to defining a problem so that they can get a clear measure at the end. So the scientist in you or something like that, you might want to try to control it so that it's easier to measure. The problem is that sometimes limits you from some of the most promising innovations. But what we want to do is define the problem in a way that it gets to the essence of what we think most needs to be addressed. Like, what is the core? So don't let yourself be drawn away just by what's easy to measure. Start with getting very, very good at at getting a group of people in a room and fleshing out, okay, what is exactly the problem? Is that the problem, or is that just a symptom of the problem? And really digging and digging and digging until you get to a problem. Or sometimes it's not a problem, but it's a possibility. And so you can get to the essence of the possibility. A second skill set that's often underrepresented is oftentimes people identify a problem, and in many organizations, the solution that's chosen is not actually the best solution, and it's oftentimes the solution that is promoted or championed by the people with the most power in the organization. So people who have positional power, or they just speak up a lot, or something else like that. So another skill that's really, really important is, once you've identified a problem, to develop empathy for the people most impacted by the problem. It's developed multifaceted understanding and insight. So how often do we identify a problem that impacts, it's a problem about something happening with students? And how often do we implement a solution without actually talking to the students, or trying to get a rich, detailed, multifaceted perspective on how this is actually experienced, the lived experience of the student who's struggling with this. Let's say it's a financial aid problem or something like that, or the way that financial aid is dispersed. Do we actually sit down and talk or observe and see what happens in the lives of the students, so that we have a much richer understanding? The reason this is so important is because when you develop that pattern of empathetic understanding and really looking at it from multiple perspectives, just being relentlessly curious, asking question upon question from different perspectives, it usually leads you to going back and reverting and adapting the problem statement. You usually fix it and clarify it because you missed something. But even if you have the problem statement clean, this multifaceted piece is going to help you now be in a good position to do the brainstorming. And now once you do the brainstorming, that's fine. Anyone can learn to brainstorm. You just get a bunch of people in the room and say, all right, all ideas are, no ideas are off limits. Let's start going. I mean, that's not that hard. And there are lots of strategies to do it. But the part after that is really hard. Oftentimes people brainstorm, and then the power position person chooses one of the items, and you just move forward with it. The next part is what people often miss in innovators, which is the prototyping stage. The prototyping stage is where you pilot or prototype something, not with the goal of hopefully having the solution, but you take one or more of those ideas, or maybe you pilot a few of them in different small populations, and your goal is not to find what works, but it's to gain actionable insight on how to move forward. In other words, you conduct these small pilots or experiments, and you see what worked or what you didn't, and you develop an even deeper understanding of the problem. And from there, it puts you in a much better position to think and speak from wisdom. And it's from that place of wisdom that you can ultimately choose the solution that you want to implement and maybe even expand more fully. And you can do different stages. So I would say that identifying problems, developing deep understanding and multifaceted understanding, and prototyping are the skill sets that are usually some of the weakest muscles in the innovator's cognitive, in their approach, in their skill sets. Sorry, I was trying to keep that metaphor still. When I was using muscles, I had to think of something else, and I couldn't think of it. My apologies. All right, so diving into this book, I'll just give you five very quick. The 5 skills of the innovator here are listed as associating, questioning, observing, networking, and experimenting. And I have these listed out here. I can send the PowerPoint over if you want, or I guess this is being recorded, so you can see it there, those who are listening to it later. I'll go through each of these just quickly, and I really recommend the book. It's a great read, and it can allow you to dive into these. I will say that if you read the book and then you set it aside, it won't do you any good. I think what a person is wiser to do is, if you're going to read the book, read it and at least do it over 5 weeks or 5 months, and then choose one of each of these and give yourself assignments, like life experiments, life assignments, where you're going to go practice associating in your work for a week or a month and trying it out, doing a little reflection, maybe find a partner who does it with you, so you can talk to each other about how this was easy or hard for you and how it helped or didn't help your work. So going through this and actually turning it into a workbook, because these really are skill sets. These are things that anyone can develop. It's a myth that there are some people that are just fundamentally innovative. innovative. Yes, there are certain maybe traits that we're born with that maybe incline us toward an openness to change or things like that. But the skill set of an innovator, I'm convinced, and coming from this conference I just finished right now, there are people with all sorts of personality traits. There are introverts and extroverts. There are eloquent speakers and those who are of few words. There are people, there are scientists and people who are from the humanities and all different fields and disciplines and dispositions. And so these skills can be developed anywhere along the way. So the first one is associating. Discover new directions by making connections across seemingly unrelated questions, problems, or ideas. So for me personally, the Medici effect, some of you may know this is a great book, essentially talking about the Renaissance kind of grew because you had all of these different ideas, think of them as disciplines, different ways of thinking, all coming together in shared spaces. And it was the synergy created by that. I mean, you put the philosophy professor with the business professor with the biology professor, and together they begin to sort of look at this problem with their own unique disciplinary perspectives. Or you take the financial aid and the student success coach and the admission counselor and someone else, and you put them together. So you have these different kind of perspectives. That's a big part of associating is recognizing that this diversity of opinion and experience is really fertile soil for identifying new possibilities and gaining new insights about the problem, because each of them will see it from a different perspective. For nurturing our own capacity for this, the way that I've done that in my own life is I've intentionally sought out books and people who come from disciplines and fields that are far from what is my primary area. I even chose conferences. Like I would go to architecture conferences, or I would go to conferences that are unrelated to my particular field. I would get incredible ideas for education or some new curricular idea by going to a conference, a healthcare conference perhaps, and looking at how they solve a problem in the healthcare industry and thinking about maybe there is a practice there that could be applied or transferred to education. So it's stretching yourself. I think as, again, one of these quotes that people always attribute, if you don't know, you pick Einstein or Lincoln, that some attribute to Einstein is that, innovation or creativity is the art of hiding your sources. So the reason they say that is because you're stepping out of your regular sphere of influence or people. You're connecting with people in this broader realm, and you're getting those ideas and then you're bringing them back. I don't think I've ever come up with a first in the world idea in my life. I've simply merged ideas from disparate locations and put them together and created this sort of quilt. And it seemed novel at the time because people in that one field haven't seen it. This is a lot of fun for many of us. I think most of us in higher ed enjoy learning at some point, and this can be really rich and refreshing for many of us in our lives. And doesn't mean, I go over the top on this because it's sort of my personality, and so I'm kind of a voracious reader of different disciplines and fields, but it doesn't have to be that much. It could just be exposing yourself a little bit, once a week or once a month, stretching yourself to kind of go experience something you don't usually. Go to an art museum if you're not an art person, or go to the theater if you don't enjoy the theater, or try something that's more, try Sudoku if you're not a numbers or person, or just those kinds of patterns are really great for cultivating this capacity for associating. And what's neat about it as the leader is if you cultivate this skill set, then when you are working through problems in your work, you're going to begin to think about association as a strategy. So you'll be more inclined to invite different people together in the room. Without this skill, people oftentimes get like-minded people because they're thinking of it more in terms of who are the most knowledgeable about this situation. So you get all the people that think alike in the room. And it's great for a quick decision and moving forward, but it may not be the best decision. So it's nothing wrong with that in some situations. It's just, if you want to cultivate that innovator mindset, it's useful. The example I often give here is the birdhouse. In fact, I have a little business called Birdhouse Learning Labs based on this metaphor. I often will prime people's thinking by showing them this picture, and then I ask the question, what does it take to build a birdhouse? Anyone want to answer? What does it take to build a birdhouse?
Location, wood.
Wood, okay.
Location.
Location.
A bird.
A bird? Yeah, I don't know. I have not seen a bird build. Oh, I guess they do build their own homes. That's all right. Okay, good. Yeah, many people will say things like a saw, a drill, maybe some nails, because I primed it with this image. But then I shift it and I say, now what does it take to build a birdhouse? Right? And you get this whole, you get this moment like, oh, wow, this is so amazing. The materials they do have an impact, but the primary purpose, a house for a bird, remains the same, even though the materials are wildly different. And this concept of association is what helps us begin to surface the educational equivalent of what you see in this picture, to help us each get away from just repeating birdhouses like this and creating the others. At Goddard, our college was built on progressive education values, Dewey and Kilpatrick. It was actually built not on tradition, the traditions of higher ed institutions. Instead, it was built upon experimentation and experience and observation of what's needed in the world. That's why we never used letter grades or standard assessment practices, or even we don't have standard rank and promotion. It was because we weren't limited by the common practices of the contemporary higher ed birdhouse. And sometimes that can be really powerful for us in small scale innovations in our individual offices, whichever college or university you're at. Let me just stop after association and just see if there are any sort of comments, if you want to say a yes and, or challenge something I shared, or ask a follow-up question.
I'll throw in a question. Would you, the things that you are talking about, does that change if you're in a situation where you need to have what I would call forced innovation, where you're in a situation where if you don't innovate, you don't survive? Does that change the dynamic here?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. And everything changes the dynamic. I would say that the 5 skill sets, though, this skill set of associating can be really powerful in any dynamic. Whether you are a billion-dollar endowed institution that has financial security and safety, so you wouldn't have to change necessarily immediately. If leaders are embracing this association practice, you're going to be more inclined to pull together different viewpoints to tackle a problem. And so you'll begin to surface new opportunities. And I would say, for example, in my institution, where it's unclear whether we're going to exist in 6 months, this is a critical skill set, is that if I just get the status quo in the room and we're solving a problem, we're going to solve the problem the way we did in the past, which is why we're in the problem. Right? If we just keep doing what we did in the past, we won't exist. So for us, the stakes are pretty high, I believe. In fact, that's why I think, even though I think they could have found a better president than me, the one thing that I brought to Goddard that some of the other candidates did, like the internal candidates, is I wasn't from the college. I actually came from outside of it, so I could look at it from a different perspective. So yeah, I'm sure it definitely impacts how you go about innovating, but it doesn't necessarily change the value of associating. It just raises or lowers the stakes a bit, I guess.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? All right. Well, great. I'll just get you a few more here. By the way, associating, I'm not going to go into all of these, but there are other ways of looking for unusual associations or connections too. I'm not going to, if you're curious about it, the last of these 4 is called Scamper. It's an acronym, and it's a tool for creative thinking. And if you're curious, just do a Google search for Scamper and creative thinking, and it will you'll find all sorts of practices, and there are actually activities you can do alone or with a group of people to help you look at a problem from different perspectives. I used to force, I used to force the online team to use this model sometimes when we were looking at a problem, and it forces you to just get out of your regular way of thinking. Like S is for substitute. So you substitute something ordinary for something different, or there's one where you do the reverse of what is said. So it seems kind of wild. Like, for example, we were talking about student retention. I said, well, what if our goal were for students to drop out as soon as possible? What would it look like if our goal was to get people to learn exactly what they need to move forward in their life, and as soon as they do, they leave and they go do it? But then we keep the doors open, they could come back. And that didn't necessarily lead to anywhere right away, but it was a good seed for at least thinking about a different way, and maybe realizing that someone who drops out isn't permanently dropping out. Maybe they just kind of come and go as they need us. So that Scamper has it's a great tool for thinking that way. Another one is generating or shifting metaphors. So oftentimes we use a certain metaphor. A lot of our thinking sometimes is like a money metaphor. Like when we talk about time in our lives, we often talk about spending time or investing your time in this effort. Switch it to a different metaphor. What if you use a metaphor other than time or other than money for time? How does it change the way you look at it? And we can do the same thing in learning. For example, a really common metaphor for learning is growth, like growing. We think of students are plants that you water and fertilize and grow. Well, that can be a helpful metaphor, but what if you switch it up? What if you think about something different? What if you think about student learning as building a network or building a strong network or a collection of connections? What if learning is really networking? How would that change the way that you approach a problem or a situation? So it's a fun tool. Another one is zooming in and out. So if you're dealing with a really narrow problem, zoom out and look at it in the bigger perspective and try to take it into account with the other offices or other things that are going on. Or if you're looking at it in that big picture, zoom in really detailed into a very narrow area. And then the one I'm going backwards here is defocus attention, which is sometimes it's like when you are, if you ever enjoy sunsets or sunrises, you don't want to stare directly at the sun for too long, right? But you're actually defocusing attention when you're enjoying a sunrise, I think in a healthy way typically, so that you're kind of taking in the whole thing. You're not just focusing your attention on one piece, you're sort of observing the whole situation. I would often do that in meetings. I've done that a lot in the past and still do, where I just kind of step back and instead of just paying attention to who's speaking at the moment, I try to look at it from the context of what's happening in the entire room. And I'm listening to that person speak while I'm seeing the other person try to keep from falling asleep in the corner, and the other person that's trying to play Angry Birds as secretly as possible in the other corner. And you just sort of get a feel for the whole dynamic and what's happening. And for me, it's a little bit less in innovation, but that's when I might say something really controversial in a meeting just because I know it will wake people up and make them put their Angry Birds down, and we can get into the conversation at hand. Or you could always say, hey, put down the Angry Birds. That's not as fun. Okay, let's see here. I'm going to go on to the second one just for time sake here. Another one that I think we all know about is questioning. And this is a skill set, I think, for any leader, any teacher, is cultivating the skill of asking provocative questions of yourself and of other people. So the goal of questioning is, again, you're trying to provoke new insights, to identify new connections, to seek new possibilities and directions. And the posture is just a posture of curiosity, of being choosing to be as curious as possible in a situation. I can personally say I have not been bored since I was about 12 years old, and I think part of it is just trying to take this posture of curiosity. If I'm in a situation that many people would define as boring, I try to ask as many questions until it becomes interesting to me. So I even do that in church if it's a boring sermon. I start asking these questions and start surfacing things until I begin to discover, oh, wow, there's something really fascinating here. Even in my own research, I do that. For example, I ran a MOOC that became internationally recognized. In fact, I've met several people here who were students in it, and it was kind of fun to connect. I ran a MOOC which is called How to Cheat in an Online Course. And it was a MOOC not teaching people how to cheat, but it was intended to help teachers mitigate against cheating. A lot of it came from me just asking really odd, unusual questions. Like I thought, well, if I were an online student, how would I cheat? What would be my strategies? And what might be my cheating without getting caught? What's good cheating? So good cheating is when I don't have to work as hard as studying. I have a low chance of getting caught, right? Those kinds of factors. So, because the best cheaters don't get caught, and most of our policies are based upon the cheaters we know about. So I was working from the assumption that we needed to explore things differently. So just asking unusual questions of the situation. And even if you don't say them out loud, maybe you don't want to take a risk of looking a little bit unusual with your colleagues. I have never had a problem with that. But Leah can tend to that. But this can really help surface some new ways of thinking. And this might seem contrarian, but even if you're not saying it out loud, just forcing yourself to at least ask a couple of questions in your own mind to challenge the status quo, whatever it is you're looking at the moment. You don't have to speak up on everyone, and you don't have to pursue every problem, but just teaching yourself to sort of challenge, okay, well, what if maybe the way we're doing it now isn't the best way? What if there is a better way? If I had the time and energy and resources, what if this were possible? And so just cultivating that way of thinking. Again, you don't have to use it every time, but you're just cultivating it. The best innovators, by the way, and this was actually, there have been some studies done on this, when they've assessed innovators who consistently achieve positive results, like they actually execute well and they get the things done that they intend to, they ask far more questions than other people. I think it was like a 3-to-1, 3 questions for the 1 question of your ordinary leader or less innovative leader. They have a very high QA ratio, as they describe it. And so that's an interesting thing. Asking questions, it doesn't mean if it's okay if there's some stupid questions. Just keep asking. And then the third one is, I'm going to skip that one for time's sake. Okay. These are a few questions, prompts you can start with. Ask what is. Questions to help clarify the current situation or circumstance. Questions that are causal in nature. What's causing this? What's at the surface? What's really behind this? And then why are things the way they are? So how did things get to where they are today? When I've taught innovation classes for grad students in the past, I often make them write a history of their organization as it relates to a particular practice or innovation so that they can understand how things got to where they are today, which is really, really helpful. It's helpful because when you're innovating, every institution has pain points, or what I call load-bearing walls. In a house, there are certain walls that are holding up the roof. So if you start renovating and you don't know what you're load-bearing, you're going to have a roof fall on top of you. So, or at least lead to a less stable or secure home. So you have to find out what those load-bearing walls are. Asking questions about why things are and how they got to where they are is critical to surfacing the load-bearing walls. So you don't accidentally break 3 things by fixing 1, right? And then what if questions, and then what if questions, adding more restraints. So what if we had to educate every student for $1,000 a semester? Or unlimited, what if we had unlimited funds to educate every single student? And so giving yourself different kind of imaginative questions to help surface some possibilities. All right, let me stop there and see if there are any questions about questions or comments or anything you're hearing this and saying, yes, I've seen this before. I can really affirm this. This is something that's important in my work. Any thoughts?
First, this is Denise. Hi. I'm just surprised and interested in how many similarities there are. I come from the arts, and how we teach students to go through the design process on any kind of design problem, and how we teach them to embrace failure, not be afraid of it, those kind of things. I'm surprised at how many similarities there are between educating in the arts and what you're speaking of.
Yeah, innovation is design thinking. At its core, it's design thinking. You're exactly right. It's the same core practices or principles.
This is Mary. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever a point where there's too many questions, or the questions get in the way of some of the prototyping or piloting? Yeah, so at some point we have to stop and switch over. So I'd say any of these can be taken to an extreme. And we have to collectively in our groups and our teams hold one another accountable for where we need to pause and stop. So yeah, at some point people can get really stuck on just asking questions. I will say this, asking questions, once you get good at it, it's addictive, and you can kind of take pride in asking questions. And sometimes you can accidentally use that and disrupt a lot of really good progress, because we're moving forward, we're ready to prototype, and someone says, yeah, but what about, or what if? And that's something we have to manage in ourselves, and watch out for others. And the way as a leader that I approach that is say, that's a really great question. What I'd like to do is see if we can bracket that. Let's put that in the parking lot so that we can maybe revisit it in phase 2. But I'd like to suggest that we try moving forward with the pilot right now. And then we can come back. But don't let us lose that question. I think it's a good one. We can come back to it later. So there is a need to kind of to manage that some, especially the more you get a culture of innovation, the more you're at risk of that happening. And I will say that faculty, being a faculty member myself too in the past, we get really good at this. We're great at slowing down innovation by just asking more and more questions. We need to have these 10 questions answered, and then these 10, and then these 10, and more and more. And that's good, and that's an incredible and valuable skill set. It just has to be kept in check, right? And any food can turn into poison if we eat too much of it, and questioning is a similar poison or food. Okay, third one is observing. And these last few I won't get in, I'll go pretty quickly on, but just carefully watching and learning around, just taking that posture of observation. So if questioning is just asking the questions, observing is just being attuned to your senses, and particularly your ears and your eyes, and really watching. You know, I'm working on a book project, and I've been studying a lot on the psychology of wonder, and it is really intriguing. The research on wonder is fun, because wonder is one of the emotions that many evolutionary psychologists struggle with, because other emotions like fear and pleasure, it's much easier for them to explain within the evolutionary construct that they're often thinking in terms of adaptation and the like. But wonder is not so easy. Wonder is a harder one, and psychologists and philosophers have both struggled to kind of explain the role that wonder plays in lives, even though most recent research shows that wonder has incredibly positive benefits: positive well-being, a sense of humility, a sense of openness and tolerating people who are different from us. And so in some ways, I would like to argue that observing is an opportunity to experience more wonder in your work that can also cultivate sort of a neutral curiosity. By the way, wonder, what's different about it also is in most emotions, if I'm afraid, I usually say, I'm afraid, or I get very inward focused. When you experience wonder, you lose sight of yourself. That's why one of the most common expressions of a moment of wonder is, wow. There's no I in wow. Or look at that. You're attending to the object, to something outside of yourself or beyond yourself. And this third posture for the innovator is really about cultivating that posture, maybe even of wonder as a verb, wondering, and doing it with your eyes and your ears. So listening and looking around, trying to observe. I'll give you an example. Years ago, we had a practice where we had a lot of really great face-to-face teachers who were teaching online for us, and yet we found that online they were not getting very good reviews from their students. And the more we dug into it, the more we found that they were it was because feedback. They were not giving as much feedback as they did to their face-to-face students. And so we decided to put together a little practice. Well, actually, so to back up, the way we really surfaced this is I did a little observing, and I actually just went around and watched some of these top faculty around campus, and I just watched them in what's called the BBC, Books, Bagels, and Coffee. It's a little coffee shop on campus. And I saw some of these amazing professors, how they would spend personal time one-on-one with students, coaching them, mentoring them, giving them personalized feedback. I mean, it was incredible the kind of attention that they were giving to the students. And yet, when they went online, they didn't do that because they didn't have that personal connection. They couldn't just speak to them. They had to type their feedback, and they felt inhibited. So we put together a little tool where they could audio record their feedback, and we actually had great results from it. We found that the faculty were likely to give 3 to 5 times as much feedback by using audio. The students were twice as likely to listen to the feedback or to use the feedback to improve a future assignment, and the students felt a stronger personal connection to the faculty. All of that came because we were willing to observe. Now, the initial conversation was, these faculty are not doing their job. We should just try to get rid of them or stop having them teach online or talk to the dean and see if we can get them in trouble. Like, that's how some people were talking and thinking about it. But instead, by taking a posture of observing and learning, we learned that it was actually our fault. We'd created an environment that inhibited one of their greatest strengths, their capacity for oral communication and connecting with the students. And so it led us to coming up with a more creative, innovative solution. And that's really what observing can do for us. So pausing to observe and to listen. You can observe, lots of ways to observe. Let me just stop and see if there are any comments on that one. Questions, thoughts?
No comments, but I have to go teach in 2 minutes, so I'm going to have to leave the webinar now. So thanks so much, Bernard.
Good. Thanks. Great to see you, Leah.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, and I'll finish up here in a couple minutes too. So the next one then is networking, and this is one looking for and learning from people who have radically different ideas and ways of doing things. I embrace in my own professional life. I interview people a lot. Like usually a week doesn't go by that I don't reach out to someone. I've read a book by them, an article by them, and I email them and ask if I could just have a 15, 20-minute conversation on the phone with them. Or I even did a podcast so that I could share my interviews with other people for a while. But it's just reaching out to people and networking. When you're at a conference, even if you're an introvert, try making a goal. I'm going to try to meet at least 5 new people and ask them about one passion project they really care about. This kind of networking is incredible. I get so many great ideas just from talking to other people. And it seems like a small thing, but it's amazing how when we get busy in our work, we often don't do that. If you go to a conference, many of us limit ourselves to the ideas of the speakers. But I would argue that at every conference I've been at in the last 10 years, the best ideas have never come from just the speakers. They come from networking and connecting with other people. So really just, developing a habit of doing that. And if you're not a person who networks naturally, giving yourself tangible goals, like I'm going to try to network with at least one person a month or something like that, just to, and stretch yourself to talk to people that are different and doing different things. And then the last one is just experimentation. And this is cultivating the skill set of how do you run a good pilot? How do you test something? How do you play with an idea and possibilities in the real world so you can see what it looks like? Putting your assumptions on the side. And there are lots of really great ways to experiment. Experimentation is the key to ethical educational innovation as well. Because if you're not experimenting and you're just implementing, then you're putting a solution out there and you don't even know if it works. It's like putting a bunch of chemical and injecting it and someone saying, well, that's what we're going to do. Let's make 1,000 of these and give them to 1,000 people. No, you kind of want to test that first. And the same way we want to test our practices and our innovations in a small scale, gain some actionable insight, get some lessons learned, and then the phrase at the end, nail it. No, just get it down, get it really refined. Then you can think about applying that to everyone. Oftentimes when we get into places of power and leadership, you might have the capacity to mandate something or to implement something that impacts dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. But I would argue that this invites us to add a measure of humility and to pause before we do that and ask, is there some way that we can at least test this out in a simple experiment for a few days or weeks or months before we scale implementation? Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not, but I think it's always good to just start with that perspective. So there are lots of different ways that innovation could look in an organization, and I'll share the slide deck so you can look at these. But this slide is a little separate from the rest of the presentation. I just kind of put it at the end. I know we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to kind of stop my slide deck. And if we have time to just do a little bit of Q&A and see if there are any sort of thoughts that are emerged, I'd love to hear from you.
Bernard, if I can make 2 announcements real quick before the questions. One, I forgot to mention, you are a fellow, 2011. So
that's right.
Another one of the fellows. And second, expect in the next week or 2, probably in the next week, the information for the mid-year retreat. both in reserving your room and your LECNA reservation. We've got a few things we need to work on the schedule, but go with the dates and information that you were given, and it's in the opening retreat notebook. So just wanted to get those in and have at it for questions.
Sounds good. So what are your thoughts? Any of this relevant to you?
I find it extremely relevant. Thank you very much. One of my favorite sayings is always ask for forgiveness, not permission.
Yeah, you know what I would say too is this construct for the ask for forgiveness, not permission is oftentimes a sign of a organization that has not created adequate space for or outlets for innovation or experimentation. I'm a big fan. One leader of an organization I respect, he often says it this way: you either go by the book or change the book, but you don't go off book. I mean, for him, his argument is the healthiest organizations, they're not ignoring the policies and the practices because they're there for a reason, but they are challenging them at times. And so creating spaces to have exceptions. One of the reasons I was able to achieve some of the success that I and the team did in my last job, where we grew online from 300 to 3,000 in 3 years, was because I was given a silo. We were actually given a space separate from the rest of the culture, where we had freedom to operate and to act differently. I was able to hire my own marketing and admissions people, my own and designers and others, and I was given some seed money to do that. And so I didn't have to feel like I was breaking the rules. I was actually given permission to operate with a different set of rules. And I think as we step into leadership roles, or as we're in leadership roles, I think it's really good for us to think about that, because now we turn the person who sees themselves as a rebel, who's maybe in opposition to leadership, we turn them into an ally, someone that we're actually creating space for and celebrating their gifts and finding a place where they can really use it for the benefit of the college.
I have another question. This is Mary. I really appreciated your statement where you started, where leaders become really good at identifying and defining problems, and really just trying to dig down to the kind of the core of the problem. Is this a symptom? Is this really the problem? And I would imagine in that process, you're going to develop a lot of you're going to uncover a lot of ancillary problems that will need to either be addressed or may not be a problem once you get to the core. So I'm just wondering, do you have any strategies or tactics or tools to kind of help navigate and capture all of the ancillary problems that arise? Yeah,
absolutely. So one is three possibilities. One is the parking lot. I love parking lots. It's always a great thing when you're facilitating with a group of people. And a parking lot can be a section on a whiteboard or a added piece of paper, so that there's something coming up and it's really relevant, but it's not at the core of the problem. And you can invite feedback from the community to determine whether the group, whether they believe it's a core to the problem. Then you can put it on the parking lot so that you attend to it. The only key there is if you're going to do a parking lot and you want people to believe that their voices and input actually matters, you have to follow up on the parking lot matters. There has to be a follow-up meeting, and so scheduling something or you have to decide not to follow up and talk to that individual and say, hey, you had a really great idea. I just don't know if we have the time to pursue it now, but I just want you to know that your ideas are really valued and that's a good one. And maybe we can find some time. Please don't let me forget it. If you can help remind me about this, that would be great. I mean, to have that kind of conversation with them. So that's one possibility. Another option is, depending upon sort of the severity of the problem, sometimes the problem that emerges is huge and maybe even bigger than the first one. So in that case, you can either break into two groups. So you can say, hey, I think we've surfaced another problem, and we're going to have to address both of these right now. Let's continue our focus on this one problem, but we're going to convene another meeting next week on this other problem, and we're going to do it. Or you just keep the group together if it's a large enough group and say, hey, who wants to tackle this problem and who wants to tackle this one? You sort of split up. You split up the team. And the third one I'm going to skip for now, but those are two that are really, that I think are really useful, that I've used a lot as a leader consistently. The third one, I'll just say this much. A third option is actually just to create a regular time to visit parking lot issues. So even if you don't kind of schedule it, so if there's that additional item, to have a regular meeting where you actually discuss those items. So maybe it's once a month or once a quarter, and you go back and you revisit all of them. And then as a group, you can prioritize which you all need to attend to the most. That way there's kind of a democratic, there's some input, collective input on what is or isn't addressed. So it doesn't come off as you as the leader, always just kind of dictating, because sometimes unintentionally you might be throwing out the idea of the same person over and over again, which has a way of isolating, as we might expect.
I apologize, but I do have to leave to go to another meeting. So thank you so much, Bernard.
Yeah, thanks. And I know we're over here, so I get it if people have to head out here. By the way, I'm happy to, if anyone wants to brainstorm, you have an idea you're trying out in your organization, you want to go back and forth with me, I think my email is in, I think you have my email probably through the communication. Just bernard.bull@gmail is fine, just gmail.com. And I'm happy to brainstorm with you.
And Bernard, if you can send me the slides, I'll get those out to everybody, and then include your email address in that email. How's that sound?
Okay, great. Granted that the Wi-Fi is adequate, I will send the slides over to you right now.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a great beginning of the term.
Good. Thanks.
Everybody, nice to see you.